Her lips curved, a hint of that wide smile he'd come to adore, maybe a hint that all would be well between them. How did you know I like emeralds? She asked. I didn't, he admitted. They reminded me of your eyes, of my. Her head cocked slightly as her mouth twisted into what could only be described as a scolding grin. Simon, my eyes are brown. They're mostly brown, he corrected. She twisted until she was facing the gilt mirror he'd used earlier to inspect his bruises and blinked a few times. No, she said slowly, as if she were speaking to a person of considerably small intellect. They're brown. He reached out and brushed one gentle finger along the bottom edge of her eye, her delicate lashes tickling his skin like a butterfly kiss. Not around the edge. She gave him a look that was mostly dubious, but a little bit hopeful, then let out a funny little breath and stood. I'm going to look for myself. Simon watched with amusement as she stood and marched over to the mirror and put her face close to the glass. She blinked several times, then held her eyes open wide, then blinked some more. Oh my goodness, she exclaimed. I've never seen that. Simon stood and moved to her side, leaning with her against the mahogany table that stood in front of the mirror. You'll soon learn that I'm always right. She shot him a sarcastic look. But how did you notice that? He shrugged. I looked very closely. You. She seemed to decide against finishing her statement and leaned back against the table, opening her eyes wide to inspect them again. Fancy that, she murmured. I have green eyes. Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say. For today, she interrupted, I refuse to believe they are anything but green. Simon grinned. As you wish. She sighed. I was always so jealous of Colin. Such beautiful eyes wasted on a man. I'm sure the young ladies who fancy themselves in love with him would disagree. Daphne gave him a smirky glance. Yes, but they don't signify, do they? Simon caught himself wanting to laugh. Not if you say so. You'll soon learn, she said archly, that I'm always right. This time he did laugh. There was no way he could have held it in. He finally stopped, realizing that Daphne was silent. She was regarding him warmly, though. Her lips curved into a nostalgic smile. That this was nice, she said, placing her hand on his. Almost like it used to be, don't you think? He nodded, turning his hand palm up so that he could clasp hers. It will be like this again, won't it? Her eyes showed a flicker of trepidation. We'll go back to the way it was, won't we? Everything will be exactly the same. Yes, he said, even though he knew it could not be true. They might find contentment, but it would never be just as it was. She smiled, closed her eyes, and rested her head against his shoulder. Good. Simon watched their reflection for several minutes, and he almost believed he would be able to make her happy. The next evening, Daphne's last night as Miss Bridgerton, Violet knocked on her bedroom door. Daphne was sitting on her bed, mementos of her childhood spread out before her, when she heard the rap. Come in, she called out. Violet poked her head in, an awkward smile pasted on her face. Daphne, she said, sounding queasy, do you have a moment? Daphne looked at her mother with concern. Of course. She stood as Violet edged into the room. Her mother's skin was remarkable match with her yellow dress. Are you quite all right, Mother? Daphne inquired. You look a little green. I'm fine. Violet cleared her throat and steeled her shoulders. It's time we had a talk. Oh. Daphne breathed, her heart racing with anticipation. She'd been waiting for this. All her friends had told her that the night before one's wedding, one's mother delivered all the secrets of marriage. At the last possible moment, one was admitted into the company of womanhood and told all those wicked and delicious facts that were kept so scrupulously from the ears of unmarried girls. Some of the young ladies of her set had, of course, already married, and Daphne and her friends had tried to get them to reveal what no one else would. But the young matrons had just giggled and smiled, saying, You'll find out soon. Soon had become now, and Daphne couldn't wait. Violet, on the other hand, looked as if she might lose the contents of her stomach at any moment. Daphne patted a spot on her bed. Would you like to sit here, Mother? Violet blinked in a rather distracted manner. Yes, yes, that would be fine. She sat down, half on and half off the bed. She didn't look very comfortable. Daphne decided to take pity on her and begin the conversation. Is this about marriage? She asked gently. Violet's nod was barely perceptible. Daphne fought to keep the fascinated glee out of her voice. The wedding night? This time Violet managed to bob her chin up and down an entire inch. I really don't know how to tell this to you. It's highly indelicate. Daphne tried to wait patiently. Eventually her mother would get to the point. You see, Violet said haltingly, there are things you need to know, things that will occur tomorrow night. Things, she coughed, that involve your husband. Daphne leaned forward, her eyes widening. Violet scooted back, clearly uncomfortable with Daphne's obvious interest. You see, your husband, that is to say Simon, of course, since he will be your husband. Since Violet showed no sign of finishing that thought, Daphne murmured, Yes, Simon will be my husband. Violet groaned, her cornflower blue eyes glancing everywhere but Daphne's face. This is very difficult for me. Apparently so, Daphne murmured. Violet took a deep breath and sat up straight, her narrow shoulders thrown back as if she were steeling herself for the most unpleasant task. On your wedding night, she began, your husband will expect you to do your marital duty. This was nothing Daphne didn't already know. Your marriage must be consummated. Of course, Daphne murmured. He will join you in your bed. Daphne nodded. She knew this as well. And he will perform certain... Violet groped for a word, her hands actually waving through the air. Intimacies upon your person. Daphne's lips parted slightly, her short, indrawn breath, the room's only sound. This was finally getting interesting. I'm here to tell you, Violet said, her voice turning quite brisk, that your marital duty need not be unpleasant. But what was it? Violet's cheeks blazed. I know that some women find the act distasteful, but they do? Daphne asked curiously. Then why do I see so many maids sneaking off with the footmen? Violet instantly went into outraged employer mode. Which maid was that? She demanded. Don't try to change the subject, Daphne warned. I've been waiting for this all week. Some of the steam went out of her mother. You have? Daphne's look was pure. What did you expect? Well, of course. Violet sighed and mumbled. Where was I? You were telling me that some women find their marital duty unpleasant. Right. Well, hmm. Daphne looked down at her mother's hands and noticed that she'd practically shredded a handkerchief. All I really want you to know, Violet said, the words tumbling out as if she could not wait to be rid of them, is that it needn't be unpleasant at all. If two people care for one another, and I believe that the Duke cares for you very much, and I for him, Daphne interrupted softly. Of course, right. Well, you see, given that you do care for each other, it will probably be a very lovely and special moment. Violet started scooting to the foot of the bed, the pale yellow silk of her skirts spreading along the quilts as she moved. And you shouldn't be nervous. I'm sure the Duke will be very gentle. Daphne thought of Simon's scorching kiss. Gentle didn't seem to apply. But Violet stood up like a shot. Very well. Well, have a good night. That's what I came here to say. That's all? Violet dashed for the door. Yes. Her eyes shifted guiltily. Were you expecting something else? Yes. Daphne ran after her mother and threw herself against the door so she couldn't escape. You can't leave telling me only that. Violet glanced longingly at the window. Daphne gave thanks that her room was on the second floor. Otherwise, she wouldn't have put it past her mother to try to make a getaway that way. Daphne, Violet said, her voice sounding rather strangled. But what do I do? Your husband will know, Violet said primly. I don't want to make a fool of myself, Mother. Violet groaned. You won't, trust me. Men are. Violet seized upon the half-finished thought. Men are what? What, Mother? What were you going to say? By now, Violet's entire face had turned bright red, and her neck and ears had progressed well into the pinks. Men are easily pleased, she mumbled. He won't be disappointed. But, but enough, Violet finally said firmly. I have told you everything my mother told me. Don't be a nervous ninny and do it enough so you'll have a baby. Daphne's jaw dropped. What? Violet chuckled nervously. Did I forget to mention the bit about the baby? Mother! Very well. Your marital duty, the consummation that is how you have a baby. Daphne sank against the wall. So you did this 8 times? She whispered. No! Daphne blinked in confusion. Her mother's explanations had been impossibly vague, and she still didn't know what marital duty was, precisely, but something wasn't adding up. But wouldn't you have had to do it 8 times? Violet began to fan herself furiously. Yes, no. Daphne, this is very personal. But how could you have had 8 children if you... I did it more than 8 times, that Violet ground out, looking as if she wanted to melt right into the walls. Daphne stared at her mother in disbelief. You did? Sometimes, Violet said. barely even moving her lips and certainly not moving her eyes off a single spot on the floor. People just do it because they like to. Daphne's eyes grew very wide. They do? She breathed. Yes. Like when men and women kiss? Yes, exactly, Violet said, sighing with relief. Very much like. Her eyes narrowed. Daphne, she said, her voice suddenly shrill. Have you kissed the Duke? Daphne felt her skin turning a shade that rivaled her mother's. I might have done, she mumbled. Violet shook her finger at her daughter. Daphne Bridgerton, I cannot believe you would do such a thing. You know very well I warned you about allowing men such liberties. It hardly signifies now that we're to be married. But still, Violet gave a deflating sigh. Never mind, you're right, it doesn't signify. You're to be married, and to a duke no less, and if he kissed you, well then, that was to be expected. Daphne just stared at her mother in disbelief. Violet's nervous, halting chatter was very much out of character. Now then, Violet announced, as long as you don't have any more questions, I'll just leave you to your, uh, she glanced distractedly at the mementos Daphne had been shuffling through. Whatever it is that you're doing. But I have more questions. Violet, however, had already made her escape. Oh. And Daphne, no matter how desperately she wanted to learn the secrets of the marital act, wasn't about to chase her mother down the hall in full view of all the family and the servants to find out. Besides, her mother's talk had raised a new set of worries. Violet had said that the marital act was a requirement for the creation of children. If Simon couldn't have children, did that mean he couldn't perform those intimacies her mother had mentioned? And dash it all, what were those intimacies? Daphne suspected that they had something to do with kissing, since society seemed so determined to make sure that young ladies keep their lips pure and chaste. And she thought, a blush stealing over her cheeks as she remembered her time in the gardens with Simon, they might have something to do with a woman's breasts as well. Daphne groaned. Her mother had practically ordered her not to be nervous, but she didn't see how she could be otherwise, not when she was expected to enter into this contract without the slightest idea of how to perform her duties. And what of Simon? If he could not consummate the marriage, would it even be a marriage? It was enough to make a new bride very apprehensive indeed. In the end, it was the little details of the wedding that Daphne remembered. There were tears in her mother's eyes and then eventually on her face, and Anthony's voice had been oddly hoarse when he stepped forward to give her away. Hyacinth had strewn her rose petals too quickly, and there were none left by the time she reached the altar. Gregory sneezed 3 times before they even got to their vows. And she remembered the look of concentration on Simon's face as he repeated his vows. Each syllable was uttered slowly and carefully. His eyes burned with intent, and his voice was low but true. To Daphne, it sounded as if nothing in the world could possibly be as important as the words he spoke as they stood before the Archbishop. Her heart found comfort in this. No man who spoke his vows with such intensity could possibly view marriage as a mere convenience. Those whom God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. A shiver raced down Daphne's spine, causing her to sway. In just a moment she would belong to this man forever. Simon's head turned slightly, his eyes darting to her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. His eyes asked. She nodded, a tiny little jog of her chin that only he could see. Something blazed in his eyes. Could it be relief? "I now pronounce you—" Gregor sneezed for a fourth time, then a fifth and a sixth, completely obliterating the archbishop's man and wife. Daphne felt a horrifying bubble of mirth pushing up her throat. She pressed her lips together, determined to maintain an appropriately serious facade. Marriage, after all, was a solemn institution, and not one to be treating as a joke. She sought She shot a glance at Simon, only to find that he was looking at her with a queer expression. His pale eyes were focused on her mouth, and the corners of his lips began to twitch. Daphne felt that bubble of mirth rising even higher. "You may kiss the bride." Simon grabbed her with almost desperate arms, his mouth crashing down on hers with a force that drew a collective gasp from the small assemblage of guests. And then both sets of lips, bride and groom, burst into laughter even as they remained entwined. Violet Bridgerton later said it was the oddest kiss she'd ever been privileged to view. Gregory Bridgerton, when he finished sneezing, said it was disgusting. The Archbishop, who was getting on in years, looked perplexed. But Hyacinth Bridgerton, who at 10 should have known the least about kisses of anyone, just blinked thoughtfully and said, "I think it's nice. If they're laughing now, they'll probably be laughing forever." She turned to her mother. "Isn't that a good thing?" Violet took her youngest daughter's hand and squeezed it. "Laughter is always a good thing, Hyacinth, and thank you for reminding us of that." And so it was that the rumor was started that the new Duke and Duchess of Hastings were the most blissfully happy and a devoted couple to be married in decades. After all, who could remember another wedding with so much laughter? We are told that the wedding of the Duke of Hastings and the former Miss Bridgerton, while small, was most eventful. Miss Hyacinth Bridgerton, 10 years of age, whispered to Miss Felicity Featherington, also aged 10, that the bride and groom actually laughed aloud during the ceremony. Miss Felicity then repeated this information to her mother, Mrs. Featherington, who then repeated it to the world. This author shall have to trust Miss Hyacinth's account, since this author was not invited to view the ceremony. Lady Whistledown's Society Papers, May 24th, 1813. There was to be no wedding trip. There hadn't, after all, been any time to plan one. Instead, Simon had made arrangements for them to spend several weeks at Cliveden Castle, the Bassets' ancestral seat. Daphne thought this a fine idea. She was eager to get away from London and the inquiring eyes and ears of the ton. Besides, she was oddly eager to see the place where Simon had grown up. She found herself imagining him as a young boy. Had he been as irrepressible as the now was with her? Or had he been a quiet child, with the reserved demeanor he showed to most of society? The new couple left Bridgerton House amidst cheers and hugs, and Simon quickly bundled Daphne into his finest carriage. Although it was summer, there was a chill in the air, and he carefully tucked a blanket over her lap. Daphne laughed. "Isn't that a bit much?" she teased. "I am unlikely to catch a chill on the few short blocks to your house." He regarded her quizzically. "We travel to Cliveden." "Tonight?" She could not disguise her surprise. She had assumed they would embark on their journey the following day. The village of Cliveden was located near Hastings, all the way down on England's southeastern coast. It was already late afternoon. By the time they reached the castle, it would be middle of the night. This was not the wedding night Daphne had envisioned. "Wouldn't it make more sense to rest here in London for one night and then travel on to Cliveden?" she asked. "The arrangements have already been made," he grunted. "I see." Daphne made a valiant attempt to hide her disappointment. She was silent for a full minute as the carriage lurched into motion, the well-sprung wheels unable to disguise the bumps from the uneven cobbles beneath them. As they swung around the corner to Park Lane, she asked, "Will we be stopping at an inn?" "Of course," Simon replied. "We need to eat supper. It wouldn't do for me to starve you on our first day of our marriage, would it?" Will we be spending the night at this inn?" Daphne persisted. "No, we—" Simon's mouth clamped shut into a firm line, then inexplicably softened. He turned to her with an expression of heart-melting tenderness. "I've been a bear, haven't I?" She blushed. She always blushed when he looked at her like that. "No, no. It's just that I was surprised at—" "No, you're right. We will rest the night at the inn. I know of a good one halfway down to the coast. The Hare and Hounds. The food is hot and the beds are clean." He touched her on the chin. "I shan't abuse you by forcing you to make the entire trip to Cliveden in one day." "It's not that I'm not hardy enough for the trip," she said, her face coloring even further as she considered her next words. "It's just that we did get married today, and if we don't stop at an inn, we'll be here in the carriage when night falls, and—" "Say no more," he said, placing a finger to her lips. Daphne nodded gratefully. She didn't really wish to discuss their wedding night like this. Besides, it seemed the sort of topic that the husband ought to bring up, not the wife. After all, Simon was certainly the more knowledgeable of the two on that subject. He couldn't possibly be any less knowledgeable, she thought with a disgruntled grimace. Her mother, despite all her hemming and hawing, had managed to tell her absolutely nothing. Well, except for the bits about the creation of children. Not that Daphne understood any of the particulars. But, on the other hand, maybe. Daphne's breath caught in her throat. What if Simon couldn't? Or what if he didn't want to? No, she decided firmly, he definitely wanted to. Moreover, he definitely wanted her. She hadn't imagined she hadn't imagined the fire in his eyes. or the fierce pounding of his heart that night in the gardens. She glanced out the window, watching as London melted into the countryside. A woman could go mad obsessing over such things. She was going to put this from her mind. She was absolutely, positively, forever going to put this from her mind. Well, at least until that night, her wedding night. The thought made her shiver. Simon glanced over at Daphne, his wife, he reminded himself, although it was still a bit difficult to believe. He'd never planned to have a wife. In fact, he'd planned quite specifically not to have one. And yet here he was, with Daphne Bridgerton. No, Daphne Bassett. Hell, she was the Duchess of Hastings. That's what she was. That was probably the strangest of all. His dukedom hadn't had a duchess in his lifetime. The title sounded odd, rusty. Simon let out a long, calming exhale, letting his eyes rest on Daphne's profile. Then he frowned. "Are you cold?" he asked. She'd been shivering. Her lips were slightly parted, so he saw her tongue press up against the roof of her mouth to make an end sound. Then she moved ever so slightly and said, "Yes." "Yes, but just a touch. You needn't." Simon tucked the blanket a bit more closely around her, wondering why on earth she would lie about such an innocuous fact. "It's been a long day," he murmured, not because he felt it, although, when he did stop to think about it, it had been a long day, but because it seemed like the right type of soothing remark for the moment. He'd been thinking a lot about soothing remarks and gentle consideration. He was going to try to be a good husband to her. She deserved at least that much. There were a lot of things he wasn't going to be able to give Daphne, true, and complete happiness unfortunately among them. But he could do his best to keep her safe and protected and relatively content. She had chosen him, he reminded himself, even knowing that she would never have children. She had chosen him. Being a good and faithful husband seemed the least he could do in return. "I enjoyed it," Daphne said softly. He blinked and turned to her with a blank expression. "I beg your pardon?" A shadow of a smile touched her lips. It was a sight to behold, something warm and teasing, and just a little bit mischievous. It sent jolts of desire straight to his midsection, and it was all he could do to concentrate on her words as she said, "You said it had been a long day. I said I enjoyed it." He looked at her blankly. Her face screwed up with such enchanting frustration that Simon felt a smile tugging at his lips. "You said it had been a long day," she said yet again. "I said I enjoyed it." When he still didn't speak, she let out a little snort and added, "Perhaps this will all seem more clear if I point out that I implied the words yes and but, as in yes, but I enjoyed it." "I see," he murmured, with all the solemnity he could muster. "I suspect you see a great deal," she muttered, "and ignore at least half of it." He quirked a brow, which caused her to grumble to herself, which of course caused him to want to kiss her. Everything made him want to kiss her. It was starting to grow quite painful, that. We should be at the inn by nightfall," he said crisply, as if a businesslike mien would relieve his tension. It didn't, of course. All it did was remind him that he'd put off his wedding night by a full day of wanting, needing, of his body screaming for release. But he was damned if he was going to take her in some roadside inn, no matter how clean and tidy it might be. Daphne deserved better. This was her one and only wedding night, and he would make it perfect for her. She shot him a slightly startled look at the sudden change of subject. That will be nice. The roads really aren't safe these days after dark, he added, trying not to remind himself that he'd originally planned on pushing straight through to Cliveden. No, she agreed, and we'll be hungry. Yes, she said, starting to look puzzled at his current obsession with their newly scheduled stop at the inn. Simon couldn't blame her, but it was either discuss the travel plans to death or grab her and take her right there in the carriage, which was not an option. So he said, "They have good food." She blinked once before pointing out, "You said that." "So I did," he coughed. "I believe I'll take a nap." Her dark eyes widened, and her entire face actually bobbed forward as she asked, "Right now?" Simon gave a brisk nod. "I do seem to be repeating myself, but I did, as you so thoughtfully reminded me, say it had been a long day." "Indeed." She watched him curiously as he shifted in his seat, looking for the most comfortable position. Finally she asked, "Are you truly going to be able to fall asleep here in the moving carriage? Don't you find the ride a bit bumpy?" He shrugged. "I'm quite good at falling asleep whenever I wish to. Learned how on my travels." "It's a talent," she murmured. "Jolly good one," he agreed. Then he closed his eyes and faked sleep for the better part of 3 hours. Daphne stared at him hard. He was faking it. With 7 siblings, she knew every trick in the book, and Simon was definitely not asleep. His chest was rising and falling in an admirable, even manner, and his breath continued just the right amount of whoosh and wheeze to sound like he was almost, but not quite snoring. But Daphne knew better. Every time she moved, made a rustling sound, or breathed just a little too loudly, his chin moved. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. And when she yawned, making a low, sleepy, moaning noise, she saw his eyes move under his closed lids. There was something to admire, however, and the fact that he'd managed to keep up the charade for over 2 hours. She'd never lasted past 20 minutes herself. If he wanted to feign sleep, she decided in a rare fit of magnanimity, she might as well let him. Far be it from her to ruin such a marvelous performance. With one last yawn, a loud one, just to watch his eyes snap to attention under his eyelids, she turned to the carriage window, drawing the heavy velvet curtain back so she could peer outside. The sun sat orange and fat on the western horizon, about 1/3 of it already resting below the edge of the earth. If Simon had been correct in his estimation of their traveling time, and she had the feeling that he was frequently correct about such things, people who liked mathematics usually were, Then they should be almost at the halfway point of their journey, almost to the Hare and Hounds, almost to her wedding night. Good gosh, she was going to have to stop thinking in such melodramatic terms. This was getting ridiculous. Simon? He didn't move. This irritated her. Simon? A little louder this time. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, pulling down into a tiny frown. Daphne was positive he was trying to decide if she'd spoken too loudly for him to continue to feign sleep. Simon! She poked him, hard, right where his arm joined his chest. There was no way he could possibly think a person could sleep through that. His eyelids fluttered open, and he made a funny little breathy sound, the sort people made when they woke up. He was good, Daphne thought with reluctant admiration. He yawned. Daph? She didn't mince words. Are we there yet? He rubbed non-existent sleep from his eyes. I beg your pardon? Are we there yet? He glanced around the inside of the carriage. Not that that would tell him anything. Aren't we still moving? Yes, but we could be close. Simon let out a little sigh and peered out the window. He was facing east, so the sky looked considerably darker than it had through Daphne's window. Oh, he said, sounding surprised. Actually, it's just up ahead. Daphne did her best not to smirk. The carriage rolled to a halt, and Simon hopped out. His exchanged he He exchanged some words with the driver, presumably informing him that they had changed their plans and now intended to spend the night. Then he reached up for Daphne's hand and helped her down. Does this meet with your approval? He asked, with a nod and a wave toward the inn. Daphne didn't see how she could render judgment without seeing the interior, but she said yes anyway. Simon led her inside, then deposited her by the door. When he went to deal with the innkeeper, Daphne watched the comings and goings with great interest. Right now, a young couple, they looked to be landed gentry, were being escorted into a private dining room, and a mother was ushering her brood of 4 up the stairs. Simon was arguing with the innkeeper, and a tall, lanky gentleman was leaning against a... Daphne swung her head back toward her husband. Simon was arguing with the innkeeper. Why on earth would he do that? She craned her neck. The 2 men were speaking in low tones, and it was clear that Simon was most displeased. The innkeeper looked as if he might die of shame at his inability to please the Duke of Hastings. Daphne frowned. This didn't look right. Shouldn't she intervene? She watched them argue a few moments longer. Clearly she should intervene, taking steps that weren't hesitant yet could never be called determined. She made her way over to her husband's side. Is anything amiss? She inquired politely. Simon spared her a brief glance. I thought you were waiting by the door. I was, she smiled brightly. I moved. Simon scowled and turned back to the innkeeper. Daphne let out a little cough, just to see if he would turn around. He didn't. She frowned. She didn't like being ignored. Simon? She poked him in the back. Simon? He turned slowly around, his face pure thundercloud. Daphne smiled again, all innocence. What is the problem? The innkeeper held his hands up in supplication and spoke before Simon could make any explanations. I have but one room left, he said, his voice a study in abject apology. I had no idea His Grace planned to honor us with his presence this eve. Had I known, I would never have let that last room out to Mrs. Weatherby and her brood, I assure you. The innkeeper leaned forward and gave Daphne a commiserating look. I would have sent them right on their way. The last sentence was accompanied by a dramatic whooshing wave of both hands that made Daphne a touch seasick. Is Mrs. Weatherby the woman who just walked by here with 4 children? The innkeeper nodded. If it weren't for the children, I'd... Daphne cut him off, not wanting to hear the remainder of a sentence that would obviously involve booting an innocent woman out into the night. I see no reason why we cannot make do with one room. We are certainly not as high in the instep as that. Beside her, Simon's jaw clenched until she would swear she could hear his teeth grinding. He wanted separate rooms, did he? It was enough to make a new bride feel extremely underappreciated. The innkeeper turned to Simon and waited for his approval. Simon gave a curt nod, and the innkeeper clapped his hands together in delight and presumably relief. There was little worse for business than an irate duke on one's premises. He grabbed the key and scurried out from behind his desk. If you will follow me. Simon motioned for Daphne to go first, so she swept past him and climbed the stairs behind the innkeeper. After only a couple of twists and turns, they were deposited in a large, comfortably furnished room with a view of the village. Well, now, Daphne said, once the innkeeper had seen himself out, this seems nice enough. Simon's reply was a grunt. How articulate of you, she murmured, then disappeared behind the dressing screen. Simon watched her for several seconds before it occurred to him where she'd gone. Daphne, he called out, his voice strangling on itself. Are you changing your clothing? She poked her head out. No, I was just looking around. His heart continued to thud, although perhaps not at quite a rapid pace. Good, he grunted. We'll be wanting to go down for supper soon. Of course, she smiled, a rather annoyingly winning and confident smile, in his opinion. Are you hungry? She asked. Extremely. Her smile wobbled just a touch at his curt tone. Simon gave himself a mental scolding. Just because he was irate with himself didn't mean he had to extend the anger toward her. She'd done nothing wrong. And you? He asked, keeping his voice gentle. She emerged fully from behind the screen and perched at the end of the bed. A bit, she admitted. She swallowed nervously. But I am not certain I could eat anything. The food was excellent the last time I ate here, I assure you. It's not the quality of the food that worries me, she interrupted. It's my nerves. He stared at her blankly. Simon, she said, obviously trying to hide the impatience in her voice, but not, in Simon's opinion, succeeding. We were married this morning. Realization finally dawned. Daphne, he said gently, you needn't worry. She blinked. I needn't? He drew a ragged breath. Being a gentle, caring husband was not as easy as it sounded. We will wait until we reach Cliveden to consummate the marriage. We will? Simon felt his eyes widen in surprise. Surely she didn't sound disappointed. I'm not going to take you in some roadside inn, he said. I have more respect for you than that. You're not? You do? His breath stopped. She did sound disappointed. No. She inched forward. Why not? Simon stared at her face for several moments, just sat there on the bed and stared at her. Her dark eyes were huge as they returned his regard, filled with tenderness and curiosity and a touch of hesitation. She licked her lips, surely just another sign of nerves, but Simon's frustrated body reacted to the seductive movement with an instant quickening. She smiled, tremulously, but it didn't quite meet his eye. I wouldn't mind. Simon remained frozen, curiously rooted to the spot as his body screamed, "Tackle her! Haul her onto the bed! Do anything! Just get her under you!" And then, just when his urges began to outweigh his honor, she let out a small, tortured cry and jumped to her feet, turning her back to him, on him, as she covered her mouth with her hand. Simon, who had just swiped one arm through the air to yank her to him, found himself off balance and face down on the bed. "Daphne," he mumbled into the mattress. "I should have known," she whimpered. "I'm so sorry." She was sorry? Simon pushed himself back up. She was whimpering? What the hell was going on? Daphne never whimpered. She turned back around, regarding him with stricken eyes. Simon would have been more concerned, except that he couldn't even begin to imagine what had so suddenly upset her. And if he couldn't imagine it, he tended to believe it wasn't serious. Arrogant of him, but there you had it. "Daphne," he said with controlled gentleness, "what is wrong?" She sat down opposite him and placed a hand on his cheek. "I am so insensitive," she whispered. "I should have known. I should never have said anything." "Should have known what?" he ground out. Her hand fell away. "That you can't, that you couldn't." "Can't what?" She looked down at her lap, where her hands were attempting to wring each other to shreds. "Please don't make me say it," she said. "This," Simon muttered, "has got to be why men avoid marriage." His words were meant more for his ears than hers, but she heard them and unfortunately reacted to them with another pathetic moan. "What the hell is going on?" he finally demanded. "You're unable to consummate the marriage," she whispered. It was a wonder his erection didn't die off in that instant. Frankly, it was a wonder he was even able to strangle out the words, "I beg your pardon." She hung her head. "I'll still be a good wife to you. I'll never tell a soul, I promise." Not since childhood, when his stuttering and stammering had attacked his every word, had Simon been so at a loss for speech. She thought he was impotent? Why? A stutter, or plain old shock? Simon thought shock. His brain didn't seem able to focus on anything other than that single word. "I know that men are very sensitive about such things," Daphne said quietly. "Especially when it's not true," Simon burst out. Her head jerked up. "It's not?" His eyes narrowed to slits. Did your brother tell you this? No. She slid her gaze away from his face. My mother. Your mother? Simon choked out. Surely no man had ever suffered so on his wedding night. Your mother told you I am impotent? Is that the word for it? Daphne asked, curiously, and then, at his thunderous glare, she hastily added, No, no, she didn't say it in so many words. What, Simon asked, his voice clipped, did she say exactly? Well, not much, Daphne admitted. It was rather annoying, actually, but she did explain to me that the marital act. She called it an act? Isn't that what everyone calls it? He waved off her question. What else did she say? She told me that whatever it is you wish to call it, Simon found her sarcasm oddly admirable under the circumstances, is related in some manner to the procreation of children, and Simon thought he might choke on his tongue. In some manner? Well, yes, Daphne frowned. She really didn't provide me with any specifics. Clearly. She did try her best, Daphne pointed out, thinking she ought, at least, to try to come to her mother's defense. It was very embarrassing for her. After 8 children, he murmured, you'd think she'd be over that by now. I don't think so, Daphne said, shaking her head. And then when I asked her if she'd participated in this, she looked up at him with an exasperated expression. I really don't know what else to call it but an act. Go right ahead, he said with a wave, his voice sounding awfully strained. Strained? Daphne blinked with concern. Are you all right? Just fine, he choked. You don't sound fine. He waved his hand some more, giving Daphne the odd impression that he couldn't speak. Well, she said slowly, going back to her earlier story. I asked her if that meant she'd participated in this act 8 times, and she became very embarrassed, and you asked her that? Simon burst out, the words escaping his mouth like an explosion. Well, yes. Her eyes narrowed. Are you laughing? No, he gasped. Her lips twisted into a small scowl. You certainly look as if you're laughing. Simon just shook his head in a decidedly frantic manner. Well, Daphne said, clearly disgruntled, I thought my question made perfect sense, seeing as she has 8 children. But then she told me that. He shook his head and held up a hand, and now he looked like he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Don't tell me, I beg of you. Oh, Daphne didn't know what to say to that. So she just clamped her hands together in her lap and shut her mouth. Finally, she heard Simon take a long, ragged breath and say, I know I'm going to regret asking you this. In fact, I regret it already. But why exactly did you assume I was? He shuddered, unable to perform. Well, you said you couldn't have children. Daphne, there are many, many other reasons why a couple might be unable to have children. Daphne had to force herself to stop grinding her teeth. I really hate how stupid I feel right now, she muttered. He leaned forward and pried her hands apart. Daphne, he said softly, massaging her fingers with his, do you have any idea what happens between a man and a woman? I haven't a clue, she said frankly. You'd think I would, with 3 older brothers, and I thought I'd finally learned the truth last night when my mother— Don't say anything more, he said in the oddest voice. Not another word. I couldn't bear it. But his head fell into his hands, and for a moment Daphne thought he might be crying. But then, as she sat there castigating herself for making her husband weep on his wedding day, she realized that his shoulders were shaking with laughter. The fiend! Are you laughing at me? She growled. He shook his head, not looking up. Then what are you laughing about? Oh, Daphne, he gasped. You have a lot to learn. Well, I never disputed that, she grumbled. Really, if people weren't so intent on keeping young women completely ignorant of the realities of marriage, scenes like this could be avoided.